It's certainly not this way anymore, but once upon a time, Canadians knew the names of the moguls who owned the biggest newspapers in this country. And one of the biggest of those big shots was George McCulloch. He owned 3 of the most important newspapers in Toronto and part of the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Argonauts, and was best pals with some of the most powerful politicians in the country, all despite coming from very modest beginnings. Mark Burry has just written a terrific biography of McCulloch. It's called Big Men Fear Me, the fast life and quick death of Canada's most powerful media mogul. And Mark joins us now here in the studio. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Let's tell the story, and we'll start at the beginning. George McCulloch was born where?
London, Ontario.
And what was his childhood like?
His dad was a union organizer in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Bad time to be a union organizer. So it was a pretty impoverished childhood. And then when he was in grade 9, his high school burnt down, so that was the end of his education.
Didn't get on with his dad too well, did he?
I don't think he got along with his father at all, and but he loved his mother. It was a big thing back then to be a total mama's boy like Mackenzie King, so they had that in common.
He got an entry-level job with the Globe. It was just called the Globe back then. It's not the Globe and Mail yet. And he got fired. And what did he say as he walked out the door?
The next time I come into this place, I'll own it. And he was 24 years old.
And it turned out to be true.
Yeah.
How many years later did he buy the place?
6.5 years later.
How about that? He managed to ingratiate himself into kind of rich society in Toronto, despite his impoverished background, to the point where he becomes part owner of the Maple Leafs, Maple Leaf Gardens, and the Argos. Yep. How did that happen?
Well, he was very social. He had great social skills. He was a big, handsome man who was very sporty, an expert on horses. The man got so much out of life through horses, making business connections with them. The Globe and Mail would not exist without horse racing. It's a key aspect of the formation of that newspaper. His horse won the King's Plate in 1939 when the King was here. So he had all of that going for him. He did like to play shinny. He had a pond up at. He owned the house that the Shoal Ice Clinic is in now, and they would play
this
hockey
in Thornhill. I guess.
Thornhill, played hockey on the pond there. Boxed, so he had a crooked nose like mine. Yeah, he was just that kind of guy who showed up to hockey games and would sit behind the bench and get in fights with guys from the other teams.
He became pals with Mitch Hepburn, who'd go on to become Premier of Ontario. How did that happen?
They were these boy wonders. Both of them were in their early 30s when their careers began here in Toronto. They were both from southwestern Ontario, so that probably broke a lot of ice. And Mitch trusted McCulloch to look after his money. So McCulloch quit the Globe or was fired, whatever happened, in 1929. So you would think that would be a bad time to go to Bay Street, but within 5 years, McCulloch had 30 people working for him selling gold stocks, and they bought and sold mine stocks that made a lot of money for people like Mitch Hepburn. So Mitch liked to drink, and he liked to make money, and politics didn't pay that well. So McCulloch became his sort of money man and somebody who exerted a lot of control over the government of Ontario. When Mitch became premier, and
Which would have been in 34, I guess.
34, and then the whole thing with the Globe starts to shape up in 35, 36.
Tell us that. Why do you want to buy the Globe in the first place?
He wanted to buy the Globe, I think, to fulfill the prophecy, and he wanted to buy it for the power. He had sold Globe subscriptions as a child. I mean, when he quit school, that's what he did. He walked up and down the concession roads of southwestern Ontario selling Globe subscriptions until they gave him a job as a reporter when he was like 21, but he'd already been selling. He was the best salesman they had. So he had this, he knew them, he was angry, he wanted to humiliate the proprietor of the Globe, a man named Jaffrey, which he did. It's very clear in the book that that's a big thing for him.
Who cried when he sold it to him?
Literally cried. The whole room, the lawyers they were probably the only ones who were crying, because I'm a lawyer, we don't cry. Because we don't have souls. So the lawyers weren't crying and McCulloch wasn't crying, but Jaffrey was there, and his wife, she was crying, and the kids are crying, and he wrote on a tear-stained note saying, "With this note, I trust you with the Globe." And a lot of it was the fact that the Globe, too, there was a big push in Toronto for someone to buy the paper because Jaffrey would not run the horse race results. And in Toronto, everybody gambled on horse racing. And McCullough, Jaffrey kept begging him, please don't take horse race results. Please don't do anything that would help the bookies. Please don't sell any liquor ads. And McCullough's like, no, I really can't do that. And he bought the paper.
Well, we got to remind people that there's the Globe, and then there's the Mail and Empire, which is another paper. And he bought that one too, merged them, created the Globe and Mail. Why did he do that?
Well, because the owner of the Mail and Empire, who was living in Montreal, a man named Killam, who had never done him any dirt, so there's no humiliation in this thing, had decided that he wanted out. McCullough was ready to spend the money, and McCullough had hooked up with a guy who had found a massive gold mine in Northern Ontario who was willing to put up the money not just to buy the Mail and Empire, which was the better paper, by the way. The Mail and Empire was a fantastic newspaper. Its records just don't survive, and people don't see it very often or hear about it. Anyways, the plan was to make the best newspaper in Canada, which they tried very hard to do. Spent a lot of money on it in the worst years of the Depression, and built a fantastic building downtown, the William Wright building. William Wright was the prospector who found this 8-foot vein of gold as he's climbing up a hill up in the Kirkland Lake area. Moss comes off, and there's this 8-foot vein of gold with nuggets and everything in it. Yeah, and Wright doesn't like people, but he loves horses. And McCullough got to him through the horse thing. And he was Wright was in Barrie, and had a horse stable there and was trying to develop a King's Plate winner. So Wright fronted the money. Eventually McCullough paid it back. And so Wright said, "Look, I don't care about newspapers." Wright wasn't even Canadian. He was from the UK. Hey, just take it, have fun with it. There were little scandal sheets called Hush, and he actually said he kind of liked to, maybe they should have bought Hush and put out a scandal sheet, but that was what McCullough's game was at all.
No, the game may actually be reflected in the title of your book, Big Men Fear Me.
Right.
Where did that come from?
That came from one of his radio speeches because, hey, when you own the Globe and Mail, that's not quite enough for George McCullough. You used to be able to buy hour-long blocks of time on the CBC, which was just pretty much every radio station in Canada because CBC owned or fed into private and public radio. And then there were other private radio stations that would also sell you hour-long blocks of time. And McCullough discovered this during the Oshawa GM strike, which was this real turning point in Ontario labor history, which of course McCullough was not on the side of the union in. And
the United Auto Workers were trying to organize the workers at GM in Oshawa.
And what happened?
What a mess.
It was a big mess. Hepburn was against it. Hepburn basically sent goons to Oshawa.
What were they called?
Sons of Mitches. These were U of T guys. A lot of the story, you can look around Toronto especially, and you can see all of these things, but you don't realize that back in the day, so many oddball things happened at places like Varsity Stadium where they auctioned off all the provincial government cars when Mitch Hepburn was premier. Or
he was the Trump of the 1930s.
He was the Trump.
Big populist politician.
And McCullough, getting back to the radio, realized that you could do this. You could be this populist leader. And we're still talking about a man who's 31, 32 years old. And he's buying radio time all over the country. And at one point in one of his radio speeches, he says these words about how powerful he is. That you can get behind me. I'm going to be this great leader. And but Mitch gets crazier and crazier, and McCullough can't really deal with Mitch's. I mean, Mitch literally, if you read, there's a book by a Jesuit priest named McKenty about Mitch, which is my favorite.
Neil McKenty.
Neil McKenty.
Great book. Yep.
It's a great book, but he makes it pretty clear that Mitch couldn't get past a bar or a house of prostitution without going in. and the way Mitch lived in the King Edward Hotel here, basically on a floor like a mafia don with goons and and sex workers and lots and lots of booze and
This is the Premier of Ontario.
This is the Premier of Ontario, yeah.
It's a different time, I guess.
It's somewhat different. Well, as far as we know, yeah.
Okay, don't get a suit here.
Okay.
Mark, but what's interesting about McCullough, though, is that for a newspaper proprietor, he's got his own issues big time. He's got mental health problems.
Yeah.
He's got alcohol problems.
Yeah.
How did those manifest themselves at him?
I think one of the things that makes him click with Hepburn was that the two of them were alcoholics for a while at the same time, and there's no better buddy than a drinking buddy. Then McCullough realized, because of McCullough's own psychological problems, that booze was not a good thing for him. He was also a good friend of an Anglican bishop named Renison, who I think was probably, just by the title of his autobiography, of One Day at a Time, kind of gives you an idea of Renison's background. That's an AA slogan. So somebody got McCullough off the booze before he bought the Globe and Mail. He was bipolar, and all through his life, people thought that he did drink.
Now, wait a sec. How do you know because they would not have diagnosed him back in the day as bipolar. So how do you know he was?
Well, they would have called him manic depressive, but it was something that was very nebulous in the research of this book, and believe me, people were not lining up to talk to me about him, and there was almost no documentation that was easy to get. But what I did find was the name of his psychiatrist in New York, and I found that this psychiatrist, his specialty was bipolar people, and he was not a Freudian psychiatrist. He didn't believe in Freudian psychiatry at all. He believed that it was all chemical, and that basically you just gave people shock treatments and got them on their way. Now, this fit really nicely with the way McCullough lived his life, and him being in New York and the fast treatment were the two things that I think were really attractive to McCullough. So McCullough rented an apartment in New York, had basically a secret place down there, and when he broke down, he would go see this guy, Dr. Kennedy, and get shock treatments and come back.
He had electroconvulsive therapy, is
Right.
I guess what it's technically called.
Yeah.
Okay. He eventually ditches Mitch Hepburn. That relationship becomes just too fraught. And he becomes best pals with the future Premier of Ontario, George Drew.
Right.
And I want to read a quote that you have in the book here of Drew campaigning in a by-election in Eastern Ontario in 1936, because this is kind of how they campaigned back in the day. Here's Drew. It is not unfair to remind the French that they are a defeated race and that their rights are only rights because of the tolerance of the English element, who, with all respect to the minority, must be regarded as the dominant race, Drew told his impoverished Protestant audience. This kind of thing played well in Ontario back then?
Hell, it plays well in parts of Ontario now. Yeah, it did. The right-wing populism played very well. There's something that people don't learn anymore of the cleavages in Ontario. In the, I would say from the time of first European settlement in a big way, farmer settlement, to maybe the 70s, was the tremendous cleavage among people from the British Isles on Protestant and Catholic lines, where the Irish were seen as a different race, the French were seen as a different race, and when people talked about race, they talked about French Canadians or Irish Catholics or whatever, and how Toronto was run by a Protestant Ulster
Orange Order.
Minority, to the point where you couldn't get a job in the city of Toronto in the 1960s if you weren't part of the Orange Lodge. Now, all that got swept away really quickly, and good riddance to it, frankly, and kind of sort of forgotten about. But it's very important to the politics of this time. The thing with McCullough was that, and one of the charming things for me is that he's not a bigot. This is not McCullough talking. This is Drew, and he's not a homophobe and the things that you would expect sort of a rich white man of that period.
He might not be those things, but he might have been a fascist.
Well, yeah, we all have our faults.
Well, hang on a sec. I mean, he was promoting one-party government for the province of Ontario during the World War II years.
And let's make it clear that his fascism was not an anti-Semitic-based fascism, thank God. I'm not too sure I would have written a positive biography about some guy who was beating that drum. What he was a guy who believed in the sort of technocratic aspects of fascism, the way fascism was portrayed by the media before the war, as a more efficient way. You know, the building the autobahns.
Trains run on time.
Trains run on time. We don't have to worry about party politics because there aren't any parties. So he had two things that he got into his head, and they're both stupid. One was get rid of the provinces, and of course that really flew. And the other was get rid of party politics. Now, lots of people believe stupid things, but if you buy the book, you see that that at one point the Premier of Ontario and the leader of the opposition in Ontario were prepared to get rid of party politics in this province. And actually, after the Oshawa strike, had a deal to do a coalition government. But it's not just a coalition government. It's pretty clear that they were going to work to get to merge the parties secretly. So maybe there would have been conservatives and liberals in the government. So they would have all sat together, I guess, and in cabinet. And the liberals promised to fund the Tory campaign in the next election. So this is really an end to party politics.
But the Toronto Star found out about it, blew the whistle on it.
Toronto, that happened. And another thing, too, was that Earl Rowe, who later became Lieutenant Governor of Ontario and for a very short time was the interim federal leader of the Tories, went to Ottawa, and he's telling everybody about this great plan. So they get up there, and he goes to the Chateau Laurier, and there's R.B. Bennett and Arthur Meehan are in the Chateau. And
Two conservative prime ministers.
Well, Arthur Meehan is a person who's never had a good book written about him. Now, Arthur Meehan was sort of the Darth Vader of Canadian politics at that time. Not a successful politician, got to say that. Lots of little like Arthur Meehan records of short-term governments, but he scared the hell out of people like Earl Rowe. And somebody grabbed Earl by the feet and shook something like resembling a brain into his head and sent him back to Toronto, and this deal was off. And then he denied it ever happened. But it did happen. There was all kinds of documentation for it. The Toronto Star knew about it, and like you say, blew the whistle on it. I'm not sure if it would have been legal, but I think the Lieutenant Governor would have gone for it. And Hepburn, not only was Hepburn sold on it, Hepburn was willing to give up the premiership to Rowe, even though Hepburn had a massive majority government and was 18 months away from an election that he handily won. So how in the world anybody talked these guys into doing this is beyond me.
Your protagonist eventually buys another newspaper, the Toronto Telegram. And there's a lawyer who helped him with the paperwork named John Tory. Who's that?
He, I believe, is the grandfather of the present mayor of Toronto. I always have trouble keeping my John Tory straight. But McCulloch really got a lousy deal on that paper. He overpaid, but it put him in this position. He hated. This story has a main protagonist, but has really funny sort of protagonists and antagonists, and one of them is Holy Joe Atkinson of the Toronto Star. And McCulloch and Atkinson, I in the book, and I write the book in a way it's meant that I want people to read it and have fun with it. And Atkinson is sort of the yin to McCulloch's yang.
Yeah.
And so McCulloch just relishes the idea of knocking the Star, which he describes in very colorful terms, off its pedestal, going to take them on in the afternoon and get out there. And he uses the Telegram to do the dirty work of his journalistic career. Right? So we get into the 1948 federal election. The Globe is being the Globe and Mail, somewhat as we know it today. And the Telegram is out there taking the pictures that are embarrassing to Louis Saint Laurent, and really exaggerating the George Drew, who's running for prime minister, he's running as the leader of the federal Tories, and he's of course put up as a Telegram like he's winning, it's going to be great. He's just got it in the bag, and of course he's losing by a long shot. So yeah, and of course in Toronto you have this newspaper war that is still somewhat famous between the Telegram and the Star, and McCulloch is the owner of the Telegram in the first part of that newspaper war. And
was he still owning the Telly in '71 when it folded?
No, he died. Well, he died in '52.
But
right.
I mean, his estate or anything like that?
John Bassett bought the Telegram right after he died. But Bassett was his sort of right-hand man. him and John McFarlane, who and JDM, we called him when I worked at the Sun as a kid. These guys were the sort of main brains of the Telegram, because by then McCulloch was spread so thin he couldn't really run this war side. And it was on Melinda Street where they stayed right through until they built the building. The Globe ended up on Front Street. And and talking about 71, and it's a bit of a leap here, but if McCulloch's career, it's only 16 years long. When you think about it, he buys the Globe and the Mail and Empire in 1936, and he's dead in 1952. And he just flies across like a comet through those 16 years. And he's on a different time than the rest of us, because he even ages faster. He's almost in dog years. And I think, when you say 71, if he had lived another 19 years, so what would he have been? In his mid-60s, this guy would have gone toe-to-toe with Pierre Trudeau. He would have been around for the Diefenbaker, the Pearson, and the Trudeau years, especially like in the late 60s and into the 70s. Easily have been a big media player at that time. So we may have only seen half of what could have been.
I'm not going to give away the ending, in as much as the manner of his death is controversial and extraordinary.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give that away. But after his death in 52, the Globe and Mail takes his picture down.
Yeah.
They take his name off the masthead.
Yeah.
It's almost like he never existed. Why did they do that?
It wasn't the Globe and Mail that we know of today. And I want to make that very clear. Thanks, Phil. Phil Crawley. The paper was sold to the Webster family in Montreal. There was a stigma about his death, about the rumors, and I'm not going to say whether they're confirmed or not, of how he died. And his death was certainly something that Toronto felt very hard. So it wasn't like he had fizzled out and no one cared. People did care. So this is a deliberate thing. If you look at the Globe and Mail, you won't see George McCulloch's name on there. You'll see George Brown's name on there.
Who founded the Globe?
Who founded the Globe. And you won't see the Mail and Empire people, because they're embarrassed about that too. It's Sir John A. founded the Mail and Empire. It's John A. Macdonald. But he was erased. He was deliberately erased from history. He was erased by the newspaper at first, and then by his own wife. According to members of his family I talked to, she married George Drew later on.
Isn't that unbelievable?
I know, small town, small world.
His widow remarried George Drew
Right.
after his death.
Who had in his files through all those years memos and stuff of dirt on George McCulloch.
In case he needed it.
In case he needed it. His best buddy, the guy that was pushing him into 24 Sussex or whatever. I guess it would have been 24 Sussex. No, not quite. But who was pushing him into the premiership in Ontario and the premiership in Ottawa. He always kept the dirt on him from his days as a stockbroker. And then McCulloch died, and George Drew's wife, who was a character in her own right, she passed away, and the two of them got married, Phyllis McCulloch and George Drew. George McCulloch's papers stuck around for a while. John Saywell at York University was a historian. He was able to use them for a paper that he wrote. And before he passed away, I was able to talk to him, and he said, no, I gave them back to Phyllis, and then she burned them. So I was left with complete scorched earth. And other people had tried to write a book about McCulloch and found the same thing, that there was just nothing. And it was this huge job of rebuilding his papers. He used stuff in the House of Lords, stuff in Ottawa and Toronto, in archives, snippets from books, oral histories, everything I could get my hands on to be able to put together enough for a book. Plus the fact he owned a newspaper, so I kind of knew where his head was at. But yeah, when you talk about that, when you talk about the picture coming down, it really is like the damning of this man's memory. And I think it was probably the cruelest thing anybody could do to him, because he loved to be known. He wanted to be famous. He moved among really famous people, the sort of jet set of the time. If anybody had told him before he died that nobody would remember him 50 years later, I'm sure he would have been appalled.
Well, guess what? They will now.
They
thanks
will
to
not.
your work.
And it feels good to bring him back. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about him. I like him. I don't like the fact he's a fascist. But as you know, I hope that if I was ever worth a biography, that it would get written about me. So
Big men feared him.
they did.
They did. That's Mark Burry, whose new book, Big Men Fear Me, The Fast Life and Quick Death of Canada's Most Powerful Media Mogul, and tells the story of George McCullough. Mark, thanks for joining us here
Oh,
at
it's a
TVO.
pleasure. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.